Before we even reach the middle of August, parts of Central and Eastern Europe are on course to record temperatures that sit 10, 11, possibly 12 degrees above what is normal for this time of year. We are not talking about a brief, uncomfortable spell that breaks after a couple of days. We are talking about a sustained, wide-ranging, potentially historic heat event that is already well supported by multiple long-range forecast systems, that is being driven by a powerful atmospheric setup that has been locking in all summer, and that is arriving on top of landscape that is already deeply stressed by heat and drought from the weeks that came before. This is the August outlook for Europe, and for a significant portion of the continent, it is a story that demands attention right now before it arrives. Let me start with where things already stand, because context matters enormously when you are trying to understand what August is likely to bring. Europe entered this summer in bad shape from a drought perspective, and the weeks since then have made things considerably worse. A major drought monitoring assessment published in late July 2026 described widespread dryness across France, Eastern Europe, the Baltic region, and significant parts of Scandinavia, with soil moisture already severely depleted across vast stretches of the continent. This is not a minor shortfall in rainfall that a few summer showers can fix overnight. It is a deep, accumulated deficit built up over months, one that takes sustained wet weather over a prolonged period to reverse, and sustained wet weather is precisely what the August outlook is not offering. The wildfires that have already been burning across France and other parts of southern and western Europe this summer are a direct product of this drought. And those fires are not an isolated event. They are part of a broader pattern of landscape stress that makes everything that comes next more dangerous and harder to recover from. When the ground is this dry and the vegetation is this parched, a heat wave that would be serious in any other year becomes something significantly worse because the land itself has no buffer left to absorb additional heat stress. Evaporation from the surface accelerates. Rivers run lower. Vegetation becomes more fire-prone, and the urban heat island effect intensifies in cities where parks and green spaces that would normally provide some cooling have dried out and lost most of their cooling capacity. All of that is the baseline condition that August is arriving into. Now, let us get into what is actually coming. The atmospheric setup driving August 2026 for most of Europe is what meteorologists describe as a blocked high-pressure dominated pattern. High pressure is the engine behind heat waves. When it builds strongly over a region and stays there, it suppresses cloud formation, prevents rain-bearing weather systems from moving through, allows the sun to bake the surface day after day without interruption, and often pulls hot air northward from North Africa directly into the heart of the continent. The setup that is establishing itself as we move into August is described by severe weather analysts as resembling a classic omega block, a configuration where a powerful high sits anchored in the core of Europe, with deep low-pressure systems positioned to the west, over the North Atlantic, and to the east, over Russia. When that pattern locks in, nothing moves. Weather systems get deflected around the edges of the block. The high sits and bakes whatever is underneath it for as long as the block holds together. This is not a pattern that resolves quickly. Omega blocks are known precisely for their tendency to persist, which is why they produce prolonged heat events rather than brief, sharp spikes that pass after a day or two. The forecast community has been watching this block develop and strengthen, and the confidence in the main features of the August heat event, its timing, its geographic footprint, and its intensity in the core affected zone has been increasing rather than decreasing as the latest model runs come in. The hottest zone in the first half of August, based on current forecasts from the ECMWF, CFS, and other major modeling systems, covers a broad arc running from the Iberian Peninsula through France into Central Europe, and then sweeping down through the Balkans into southeastern Europe. This is an enormous area, encompassing dozens of countries and hundreds of millions of people, and the temperature anomalies being projected across it are extraordinary by any historical standard. Interior Portugal and central Spain are looking at temperatures running 6 degrees or more above what is normal for early August. And this is on top of a region that is already one of the hottest in Europe during midsummer under typical conditions. Spots in France, which is already dealing with serious wildfire activity this summer, could sit 7 or even more degrees above average during the peak of this event, compounding the fire risk across vegetation that has been drying out for weeks. Northern Italy is similarly positioned for extreme heat, with anomalies of 4 to 5 degrees above average, pushing daytime temperatures into territory that put significant strain on public health systems, power grids, and water supply infrastructure simultaneously. But the zone that is drawing the most concentrated attention from forecasters right now, and the area where the highest temperature anomalies are most likely to concentrate during the peak of the event, runs through Central Europe, specifically through Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Romania, and the surrounding areas. This is the pocket where multiple forecast models are converging on temperature anomalies of 10 to 12 degrees above the seasonal average during the most intense phase of the event, which is expected to build through the first week of August and potentially intensify further into the second week before the heat core begins its eastward drift. When a region that is already hot in midsummer runs 10 or 12 degrees above its normal peak, the numbers that result are genuinely dangerous. We're talking about daytime highs reaching deep into the 40s Celsius across parts of this zone, with some forecast runs pointing toward the potential to challenge or break national and regional temperature records in countries that have been setting new benchmarks repeatedly over the past several summers. The 2024 European heat event produced temperatures as high as 46.8 degrees Celsius in Cyprus and caused over 62,000 heat-related deaths across the continent, according to research published in Nature Medicine. The 2026 event arriving in August does not currently appear likely to exceed that scale in its entirety, but for the specific zone of Central and Southeastern Europe, The combination of extreme temperature anomalies, deep pre-existing drought, and a landscape that has already been stressed by the earlier heat events of May and June creates conditions where the health and safety risks are elevated well beyond what the raw temperature numbers alone might suggest. The Severe Weather Analysis Group at Severe Weather EU, tracking this heat dome's development in real time, described the thermal anomalies as tracking into the 99th percentile in some of the upper air measurements, the kind of numbers that indicate not just a significant heat wave, but a potentially historic one for the specific regions affected. Their analysis pointed to temperatures surging past 40 degrees Celsius widely across the Iberian Peninsula in France during the late July into early August peak, with the core of the ridge then drifting eastward and dragging punishing heat into western Germany, the Benelux countries, Italy, Hungary, and much of the northern Balkans through the following days. The source of the heat is a Saharan air mass being pumped directly northward into the continental interior, the same basic mechanism that has driven the worst European heat events of the past decade, but amplified by an atmospheric setup that is holding it in place rather than allowing Atlantic systems to flush it out. A few parts of Europe look noticeably different from this pattern, and it is worth being clear about that because forecasts that paint the whole continent with one brush tend to mislead people who live in the areas that do not fit the main narrative. Norway, for example, is expected to run below average for temperatures during the early part of August, coinciding with more active rainfall in some areas along the coast. Sweden and Finland are expected to sit roughly around average, or just slightly above, without the extreme heat anomalies being forecast further south. Scotland looks likely to be several degrees below average during the first week of August, while England could simultaneously be running a couple of degrees above, a sharp divide within the same island that reflects different influences from the jet stream and Atlantic weather systems. Greece, Albania, and Turkey sit closer to average for both temperature and rainfall than the hot core of Central and Eastern Europe. So the map is not uniform, and where you are in Europe determines your experience of this August considerably. But the dominant signal, the signal that multiple major forecast systems agree on, is clearly above average heat across most of the continent, with extreme anomalies concentrated in the central and southeastern zones. On the rainfall side, the picture is deeply concerning. Precipitation outlooks for August show significant deficits, well below average totals, across most of the same areas that are already drought-stressed from the spring and early summer. Some of the numbers being projected are stark. Parts of the Alps and adjacent areas could run 100 millimeters or more below their typical August rainfall total, which, in a single month's context, represents an enormous shortfall. Northern Italy and the areas extending into Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and North Macedonia are similarly positioned for well below normal rainfall. The dry areas are not just holding their current deficit, they are expanding it week by week, with the heat accelerating the drying process as higher temperatures drive faster evaporation from soils and vegetation that are already running low on moisture. The exception zones for rainfall, where above average totals are actually possible, are relatively narrow. Coastal sections of Norway could see meaningful additional rainfall. Ireland has a reasonable chance of picking up some above average precipitation. Parts of Sweden and Finland may benefit from more active weather systems moving through, but for most of the continent, August does not look like the month that breaks the drought. The consequences of this combination, prolonged extreme heat sitting on top of a deep drought, extend well beyond personal discomfort. The wildfire situation, already serious across France and other parts of southern Europe, faces significant additional pressure from these conditions. The Climate Impact Company's drought analysis was explicit about this, describing a major drought unfolding as meteorological summer fades, with heat and dryness spreading eastward through the period. When vegetation is severely moisture-stressed, fire weather conditions can develop rapidly, even in areas that are not traditionally high risk, as the fires across France this summer have already demonstrated. Agricultural impacts are also a serious concern. Rivers and reservoirs that are already running low from the dry spring and early summer face continued stress through August, with implications for irrigation, hydroelectric generation, and water supply that will compound rather than ease as the drought extends. Now let us look beyond August, because this weather pattern does not simply stop when the calendar turns to September. The broader climate driver behind this summer, El Niño, entered a phase of rapid strengthening through July of 2026. NOAA and the World Meteorological Organization both placed the probability of El Niño continuing into early 2027 above 95%, with a very strong event looking increasingly likely through the October to December window specifically. El Niño's influence on European weather is complex and sometimes limited compared to its dramatic effects elsewhere in the world, but during the warm season, it tends to reinforce the kinds of high pressure blocking patterns and prolonged heat that Europe has been experiencing all summer. The WMO's multi-model outlook for August through October shows above normal sea surface temperatures in the relevant ocean areas remaining strongly in place, supporting continued warmth over the continent through the early autumn months. The September picture, looking ahead to the next season snapshot, shows above average temperatures persisting across much of Europe, particularly in eastern areas, though more active. Atlantic frontal systems should begin to move through more frequently than they have during the peak of the summer block. These fronts could bring some welcome rainfall to parched areas, but they are also capable of producing intense convective events, heavy localized downpours and thunderstorms over bone-dry ground that has lost much of its capacity to absorb water quickly. Flash flooding on drought-hardened soil is a known risk in these transitional periods, and it is one worth keeping in mind as autumn approaches. October continues the above-average temperature signal, with the influence of a strong El Nino reinforcing a milder-than-average early winter, though the pattern is expected to shift toward wetter conditions as the season progresses and the continent moves past the peak of the summer heat regime. For the immediate weeks ahead, the most critical period is the stretch from roughly the 1st of August through the middle of the month, when the heat wave is expected to peak and potentially intensify over the Central European core. Anyone in Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Romania, and the surrounding countries should treat this forecast seriously and take practical steps now, rather than waiting until the heat has already arrived. Temperatures running 10 to 12 degrees above seasonal averages in this region will produce conditions where extreme heat is not just uncomfortable but actively dangerous, and the danger is not limited to people who are already in frail health. At the kind of temperature anomalies being forecast, outdoor workers across agriculture, construction, and logistics face serious heat stress risk during afternoon hours. Urban areas with large amounts of paved surface and limited green space will retain heat overnight, preventing bodies from recovering between daytime exposure events, which is what makes prolonged heat waves so much more dangerous than single extremely hot days. Nighttime temperatures across cities in the affected zone could remain above 20 degrees Celsius throughout the event, a condition that European public health agencies have identified as particularly dangerous for elderly residents living without air conditioning, which remains less common across much of Central and Eastern Europe than in regions that have historically experienced more regular summer heat extremes. Wildfire risk across France, northern Italy, and much of the Balkans will remain elevated and likely worsen during this period, as the heat accelerates the drying of vegetation that is already at or near critical moisture thresholds. Water resources in already stressed river systems face additional pressure that will not be reversed by any single weather event. Rhine, Danube, and Po tributary levels are already significantly below seasonal norms in some areas, and the continuation of heat and drought through August will push some of those levels to points where industrial cooling water withdrawals, recreational shipping, and hydroelectric output all face constraints simultaneously. The Climate Impact Company's week-by-week breakdown of August confirms the phased character of this event. Their analysis for the first week of August through roughly the 9th describes continued hot and dry conditions with an eastward extension of the heat wave core into the western Black Sea region. The second week, from roughly the 9th through the 16th, sees the heat wave's eastward expansion continue, with the most extreme heat pushing further into Eastern Europe and the Black Sea coastline, while patchy and unreliable rainfall attempts to reach some coastal northwestern areas. By the 3rd and 4th weeks of August, the heat center is projected to shift toward Eastern Europe and Western Russia, while Portugal and Spain remain hot and dry in the southwest, and some more meaningful wet weather finally begins to establish across Germany and Poland, offering those countries their first real relief from a dry stretch that has been building since spring. The extended outlook into September and October adds important additional context. Rather than the standard summer to autumn transition that brings widespread cooling and returning rainfall to most of Europe, the September 2026 picture shows above-average temperatures persisting across much of the continent, particularly in eastern areas. The 2025 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that atmospheric blocking patterns of the type producing this summer's extended heat have nearly tripled in frequency since the 1950s, driven by human influence changes to the jet stream and the temperature gradient between the poles and the tropics. A note on the few areas that genuinely do look different from the dominant narrative this month. Norway looks set to be below average for temperature during the early part of August, and should see above average rainfall along parts of its coast, which represents a real and welcome contrast to the situation across most of the continent. Sweden and Finland sit closer to average rather than significantly above it, and the most extreme heat and drought anomalies do not extend into those countries in the same way they affect the central and southeastern zones. Greece and Turkey, somewhat counterintuitively, sit closer to average for both temperature and rainfall than the European interior, positioned at the margins of the main heat core rather than beneath it. Ireland has a reasonable chance of picking up some above-average rainfall, potentially offering farmers there something the rest of the continent cannot currently expect. England presents a sharp divide from Scotland in the first week of August, with Scotland running a couple of degrees below average, while England sits above. A reminder that within a single country, the gradient between different atmospheric influences can be quite dramatic during a continental scale blocking event. What all of this adds up to for Europe in August 2026 is a month that will be remembered as one of the more significant weather events of the decade in the affected zones. A heat wave that is not just another hot spell, but a genuine test of infrastructure, public health systems, water management capacity, and agricultural resilience across a huge swath of the continent, arriving at the end of a summer that has already been stressful and on top of a drought that was already serious before August even began. Track this closely wherever you are in Europe. Check updates from your National Meteorological Service regularly as the month unfolds. And if you're in the central or southeastern zone, where the most extreme anomalies are forecast, take the practical steps now to prepare for conditions that are likely to be significantly more demanding than a typical August week. The longer-term picture being signaled by El Nino, by the persistent drought, and by the high-confidence forecast of above-average temperatures through September and into October points toward a late summer and early autumn that will require continued attention rather than offering a quick return to normal. The pattern that has characterized European weather since late spring 2026 is not breaking down in August. It is evolving, shifting its center of action somewhat, but maintaining the same fundamental character of heat, dryness, and above-average temperatures that has defined the season from early on. The forecast systems that have been tracking this development since April and May have been largely consistent, and the August update reinforces rather than revises that broader picture. The bottom line for August 2026, in the clearest terms possible, is this. A powerful heat wave is building for Central and Southeastern Europe, with the most extreme anomalies expected over Slovakia, Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, and Romania during the first 2 weeks of the month. Western Europe, including Spain, France, and Italy, will also experience significant above-average heat. Drought conditions will expand and intensify rather than ease. Wildfire risk remains a serious concern from France through the Balkans. Northern Europe will be relatively more comfortable, but not entirely insulated from the broader pattern. And the background driver of this whole situation, a strengthening El Nino, shows no signs of weakening, pointing toward continued warmth and its associated risks well into the autumn months ahead. The longer-term picture adds one more layer worth understanding before we close. Europe has now experienced 3 consecutive summers with significant heat and drought anomalies, a pattern that researchers studying atmospheric blocking have documented with increasing concern. A 2025 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that the kind of high-pressure blocking events producing these extended heat waves have nearly tripled in frequency since the 1950s, driven by changes to the temperature gradient between the tropics and the Arctic that alter how the jet stream behaves. This is not a background statistic disconnected from what you are feeling right now or what August is about to deliver. It is the scientific explanation for why events like this are happening more often, lasting longer, and hitting harder than the equivalent events of 20 or 30 years ago. The El Nino layered on top of this longer-term shift is reinforcing warmth and dryness, specifically during this summer and autumn window, with NOAA's latest assessment putting the probability of a very strong El Nino event through October, November, and December at over 80%, the highest confidence assessment the agency has issued for this season. That combination, a structure